"Ma'am, I need you to move to seat 42F immediately. You don't belong in first class." The flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin like a blade, her perfectly manicured finger pointing dismissively at the woman in the simple navy blazer. Passengers turned to stare as the commotion unfolded aboard Skyline Airways Flight 891, bound from Denver to Miami on what should have been a routine Tuesday evening departure. But when the Boeing 767 suddenly lurched violently to the left, when the oxygen masks dropped without warning, when Captain James Whitfield's panicked voice crackled over the intercom announcing, "All crew to emergency stations," nobody expected the quiet woman in seat 2A to stand up and speak 3 words that would change everything. "I'll take command." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The chaos had begun innocuously enough. Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell had been making her pre-departure rounds through the premium cabin when she noticed something that made her blood boil. A woman who clearly didn't belong in first class was sitting calmly in one of the most expensive seats on the aircraft. The passenger wore a simple dark navy blazer over a white cotton shirt, practical black slacks, and worn leather shoes that had seen better days. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and she carried a battered canvas messenger bag instead of the luxury handbags typical of first-class travelers. Jessica had worked for Skyline Airways for 8 years, and she prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity that first-class passengers paid premium prices to enjoy. She had seen every type of passenger try to sneak into upgraded seats. College students hoping to get lucky, business travelers trying to bluff their way forward, even elderly passengers claiming confusion about their seating assignments. This woman, who appeared to be in her early 50s with calloused hands and the weathered complexion of someone who spent time outdoors, clearly fit the profile of someone who had wandered into the wrong section. "Excuse me," Jessica said, approaching seat 2A with her most professional smile masking her irritation. "I need to see your boarding pass, please." The woman looked up from the technical manual she was reading, something thick and boring about aviation systems that Jessica couldn't quite make out. "Of course," she replied quietly, producing a standard boarding pass that showed seat 42F in economy class. "I thought so," Jessica said, her voice gaining confidence as several first-class passengers began paying attention to the confrontation. "Ma'am, you're in the wrong section. Your assigned seat is in the back of the aircraft." A businessman in an expensive Italian suit looked up from his champagne and chuckled. "Another seat upgrader trying to get something for nothing," he muttered to his companion, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Security should be tighter about this sort of thing." The woman in seat 2A remained completely calm. "I understand the confusion," she said in a measured tone. "There was a last-minute seating change. Perhaps you could check with the captain." Jessica's professional demeanor cracked slightly. The audacity of this woman to suggest that she, a senior flight attendant, needed to bother the captain with something as simple as a passenger sitting in the wrong seat was insulting. "Ma'am, I don't need to check with anyone. This is clearly a case of unauthorized seat occupation. I need you to gather your belongings and move to your assigned seat immediately." Other passengers in first class were now openly staring and whispering among themselves. An elderly woman in seat 1B shook her head disapprovingly. "In my day, people knew their place," she said to her husband. "Now everyone thinks they're entitled to special treatment." The woman in the navy blazer began gathering her things without argument, but there was something in her posture, a certain bearing, a way of moving with quiet authority, that suggested this wasn't someone accustomed to being dismissed. As she stood to leave, She glanced once toward the cockpit door with an expression that seemed almost protective, as if she were reluctant to move away from the front of the aircraft. "Thank you for your cooperation," Jessica said with satisfaction, already mentally composing the report she would file about properly maintaining cabin security protocols. But as the woman walked slowly toward the back of the aircraft, something began to go wrong. The Boeing 767 had been cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet over the Colorado Rockies when the first indication of trouble appeared on the flight deck. Captain James Whitfield, a veteran pilot with 23 years of commercial aviation experience, noticed an unusual vibration in the left engine. His first officer, David Reynolds, was already scanning the instrument panel with growing concern. "Captain, we're showing some anomalous readings on engine number 1, Reynolds reported, his voice tight with professional concern. "Oil pressure is fluctuating and we've got an intermittent warning light." In the passenger cabin, the subtle vibration was beginning to intensify. Drinks started rippling in their glasses, and passengers began shifting nervously in their seats. The woman who had been forced to move from first class was now seated in 42F, but instead of settling in with a book or magazine like a typical passenger, she was listening intently to the changing sounds of the aircraft engines. Then everything went wrong at once. The left engine didn't just fail, it exploded in a cascade of metal fragments and burning fuel. The Boeing 767 lurched violently to the left as massive chunks of engine cowling struck the wing and fuselage. Emergency lights bathed the cabin in pulsing red as oxygen masks deployed from the overhead compartments. The aircraft began a sickening roll to port as Captain Whitfield fought desperately to maintain control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday!" Whitfield's voice crackled over the radio. "Skyline 891, catastrophic engine failure, declaring emergency, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." In the passenger cabin, chaos erupted. People were screaming, crying, and praying as the aircraft shuddered and bucked like a wild animal. Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell, who moments before had been smugly enforcing seating protocols, was now gripping a bulkhead for support as she tried to help terrified passengers with their oxygen masks. But in seat 42F, the woman in the navy blazer remained eerily calm. While other passengers panicked, she was methodically reviewing something in her mind. Calculations, procedures, contingencies that most civilians could never comprehend. When Captain Whitfield's voice came over the intercom again, this time with barely controlled desperation, she knew what she had to do. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing a serious emergency and will be making an immediate descent. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing procedures." The woman in 42F unbuckled her seatbelt and began walking forward through the chaos, moving with the steady gait of someone who had trained for exactly this type of crisis. Jessica Hartwell saw her approaching and shouted over the noise of screaming passengers and groaning metal, "Ma'am, return to your seat immediately. This is an emergency." But the woman didn't stop. She reached the cockpit door and knocked with a specific pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. From inside the cockpit, Captain Whitfield's voice could be heard shouting instructions to his first officer. But when he heard that particular knock, everything went silent. The cockpit door opened and Captain Whitfield's face appeared, haggard with stress and fear. He looked at the woman standing there and his expression transformed completely, from desperation to relief, from fear to hope. "Admiral Martinez," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin despite the ongoing crisis. "Thank God you're here." The entire first-class section fell silent, even as the aircraft continued to shudder and fight against its damaged engine. Admiral Carmen Martinez had spent the last 3 hours of her life being completely invisible, and that was exactly how she preferred it. As she settled into seat 42F in the economy section of Skyline Airways Flight 891, She looked like nothing more than a middle-aged civil servant heading home from a mundane government conference in Denver. Her appearance was so thoroughly unremarkable that passengers' eyes simply slid past her without registering any details worth remembering. At 52 years old, Carmen had mastered the art of blending into civilian crowds. Her graying chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with a plain black elastic band, the kind sold in pharmacy checkout lines across America. She wore no makeup except for a touch of clear lip balm, and her skin showed the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years working outdoors rather than in climate-controlled offices. Small lines around her green eyes spoke of countless hours squinting into sun and wind, but to casual observers they suggested nothing more than a woman approaching middle age. Her clothing was deliberately chosen from the most ordinary sections of department store racks. The navy blue blazer was a classic cut from a mid-range retailer, showing slight wear at the cuffs, and a small mend near the left shoulder that had been expertly but simply repaired. Underneath, she wore a white cotton button-down shirt, crisp but not expensive, the kind that could be found at any business casual store in any shopping mall. Her black slacks were practical rather than fashionable, made from a durable blend fabric that traveled well and didn't wrinkle easily. Even her accessories reinforced the image of mundane professionalism. She wore a simple Timex watch with a black leather band, the kind of timepiece that government employees received as retirement gifts. Her only jewelry was a plain gold wedding band that had been worn smooth by years of wear, and small gold stud earrings so understated they were practically invisible. The canvas messenger bag at her feet was forest green and showing its age, scuffed corners and faded areas where the strap had rubbed against the fabric over time. To the businessman in seat 41D, she appeared to be exactly the type of mid-level bureaucrat he encountered in government offices, competent but unremarkable, the kind of person who processed forms and attended meetings and counted the years until retirement. The college student in 42E assumed she was someone's mother heading home from visiting family, probably divorced given that she was traveling alone, probably working in accounting or human resources at some forgettable company. The elderly couple in seats 43F and 43G had chatted briefly with Carmen during boarding, and their assessment was equally ordinary. "Seems like a nice woman," the wife had whispered to her husband. "Probably works for the city government or something like that. Very polite, but nothing special about her." Carmen encouraged these assumptions through every detail of her behavior. When the flight attendant had asked about her beverage preference during the pre-departure service, she had requested water with no ice, the choice of someone watching her health without being particular about it. She had politely declined the offered peanuts and instead pulled a simple granola bar from her bag, unwrapping it with the efficiency of someone accustomed to eating practical meals rather than indulgent snacks. Her reading material reinforced the illusion of ordinariness. The book, resting on her lap, was a thick technical manual titled Federal Aviation Safety Protocols and Emergency Procedures, exactly the kind of dry regulatory publication that government employees were often required to study for continuing education credits. To anyone glancing over, it looked like homework rather than passion, obligation rather than expertise. But if those same passengers had looked more carefully at how Carmen was reading that manual, they might have noticed details that didn't quite fit their assumptions. She wasn't reading it sequentially like someone working through required material. Instead, she was jumping between sections with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly where to find specific information. Her annotations in the margins weren't the careful notes of a student, but the quick shorthand of an expert cross-referencing procedures she had used countless times before. When turbulence had briefly shaken the aircraft during their climb out of Denver, Carmen's reaction had been subtly different from the other passengers. While others gripped their armrests or looked around nervously, she had simply tilted her head slightly, listening to the subtle changes in engine harmonics and feeling the aircraft's responses with the instinctive awareness of someone who understood exactly what those sensations meant. The canvas messenger bag at her feet contained items that would have told a very different story about her identity, but they were buried beneath layers of deliberately ordinary belongings. On top were the expected items: reading glasses in a drugstore case, tissues, breath mints, a paperback romance novel that she had never actually opened but carried as camouflage, and a small wallet containing credit cards issued to Carmen Martinez with an address in Virginia that suggested nothing more remarkable than suburban living. Beneath these mundane items, hidden in zippered compartments and wrapped in unremarkable cloth, were objects that spoke of a very different life. A military identification card with security clearances so high that most people had never heard of them. Technical manuals that weren't available to civilian readers. Communication devices that could reach secure networks anywhere in the world. And a worn leather notebook filled with radio frequencies, aircraft specifications, and emergency protocols written in the precise handwriting of someone who had spent decades managing life-and-death aviation operations. But to every passenger and crew member on Flight 891, Carmen Martinez was simply a forgettable middle-aged woman in economy class, someone who blended so seamlessly into the background of commercial aviation that she might as well have been invisible. She was the kind of passenger that flight attendants helped politely but didn't remember afterward, that other travelers sat next to without striking up conversations, that airport security waved through without a second glance. This carefully cultivated anonymity was not accidental. Carmen had spent the last 18 months perfecting the art of disappearing into civilian life, learning to dress and speak and move in ways that erased any trace of the authority and competence that had defined her for 3 decades of military service. She had studied how ordinary people behaved in airports and on airplanes, noting their mannerisms and concerns and conversations until she could mimic their patterns flawlessly. The transformation had been necessary for reasons that went far beyond simple retirement planning. Admiral Carmen Martinez, though no passenger on Flight 891, knew that title belonged to the quiet woman in 42F, had commanded operations so sensitive that her very presence on commercial aircraft was considered a security risk. Her retirement from active duty had been accompanied by extensive briefings about maintaining operational security in civilian environments, about the importance of remaining invisible to foreign intelligence services who would pay extraordinary sums to identify and target someone with her knowledge. So she had learned to become nobody special, and she had succeeded so completely that when Flight 891 encountered the crisis that would define every passenger's understanding of heroism and expertise, nobody expected the quiet woman in economy class to be the one person on board capable of saving their lives. The humiliation began before Carmen had even finished gathering her belongings from seat 2A. Jessica Hartwell stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently as if Carmen were deliberately wasting her valuable time. The flight attendant's voice carried clearly through the first-class cabin, ensuring that every premium passenger could witness what she clearly considered a victory for proper protocol enforcement. "I don't understand why some people think they can just help themselves to seats they didn't pay for," Jessica announced loudly, ostensibly speaking to her colleague, but obviously performing for the audience of first-class passengers. "It's really not fair to the customers who actually purchased these accommodations." The businessman in the Italian suit, Marcus Rothwell, according to the luggage tag on his expensive leather briefcase, looked up from his pre-departure champagne with obvious amusement. "Probably saw an empty seat and thought she'd try her luck," he said to his companion, a sleek woman in designer clothing who was scrolling through her phone with manicured nails. You'd be amazed how entitled some people feel these days. His companion, Dr. Vivian Cross, according to the medical journal she had been reading, glanced dismissively at Carmen's practical clothing. "Look at that messenger bag," she whispered just loudly enough to be heard. "Probably bought it at a thrift store. Some people have no sense of appropriate presentation for premium travel." The elderly woman in seat 1B, Mrs. Dorothy Blackstone, shook her head with the disapproval of someone who had been raised with strict social hierarchies. "In my generation, people knew their place and stayed there," she informed her husband, Harold, who was pretending to read his newspaper while clearly enjoying the drama. "Now everyone thinks they deserve special treatment just for showing up." Carmen moved slowly down the aisle, carrying her canvas bag with quiet dignity, despite the whispered comments that followed her retreat. She could feel dozens of eyes tracking her movement, first-class passengers exchanging knowing glances and satisfied smirks as if they had just witnessed justice being properly served. Their expressions suggested they believed they were watching a valuable lesson about respecting social boundaries and knowing one's proper place in the world. "Probably some government clerk trying to upgrade herself," muttered a man in seat 3D who was wearing a military contractor's company polo shirt. "These civil service types always think the rules don't apply to them. I see it all the time when I'm traveling on defense contracts." A young woman in seat 4A, clearly a tech executive based on her laptop, covered in startup stickers, looked up from her work to observe Carmen's walk of shame. "Did you see how she just sat there like she belonged?" she said to her traveling companion. "The audacity is really incredible. I bet she was planning to pretend it was a mistake if anyone questioned her." Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell followed Carmen's progress through the cabin with obvious satisfaction, making sure that her authority had been properly demonstrated to all the paying customers. She had encountered seat upgraders before, but this woman's calm assumption that she belonged in first class had particularly irritated her. There was something about Carmen's quiet confidence that had suggested she genuinely believed she had a right to be there, which made the correction feel even more necessary and satisfying. "Thank you for your cooperation," Jessica called out as Carmen approached the economy section, her voice carrying a tone of professional condescension that left no doubt about who had won this particular confrontation. "I'm sure you'll be much more comfortable in your assigned seat." As Carmen entered the main cabin, the mockery followed her like a wake. Economy passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were already buzzing with commentary and speculation. A group of college students traveling together found the situation particularly entertaining, sharing amused glances and whispered jokes about people trying to live beyond their means. "Did you see her face when she got busted?" one of them snickered. "She looked so shocked, like she couldn't believe someone actually called her out." "Probably thought she could just act like she belonged there and no one would notice," added another. "Classic wannabe behavior. My mom does stuff like that at hotels sometimes." A middle-aged couple in matching tourist t-shirts had watched the entire scene with the fascination of people who rarely encountered this type of drama in their daily lives. "Can you imagine the nerve?" the woman said to her husband. "Just sitting there in first class like she owned the place." What was she thinking? Her husband, a retired postal worker named Frank Morrison, shook his head with the certainty of someone who had spent decades following rules and regulations. "People today have no respect for order," he declared. "When I was working, you followed the procedures or you faced the consequences. Simple as that." Even the flight crew members who had witnessed the incident were sharing their opinions during their pre-departure preparations. The second flight attendant, Robert Kim, had watched Jessica handle the situation and approved of her firm approach. "You handled that perfectly," he told her during a brief consultation near the galley. can't let people think they can just take whatever they want. The pilots, Captain James Whitfield and First Officer David Reynolds, had been informed about the seat dispute through standard crew communication protocols, but they had dismissed it as a routine passenger service issue. Captain Whitfield, focused on his pre-flight checklist and weather briefings, had barely registered the details beyond noting that his cabin crew had resolved a seating problem efficiently. Probably just another passenger trying to upgrade herself, he had commented to Reynolds without looking up from his instrument checks. Jessica knows how to handle these situations. Good thing we caught it before takeoff. Nothing worse than dealing with entitled passengers once we're airborne. As Carmen finally reached seat 42F and began stowing her belongings in the overhead compartment, the whispered commentary continued around her. Other economy passengers were already forming their own judgments about the woman who had tried to sit where she didn't belong. Their assumptions were reinforced by her unremarkable appearance and practical clothing, which seemed to confirm that she was exactly the type of person who might try to sneak into premium accommodations. A businessman in seat 41C, traveling on a tight company budget, felt a surge of moral superiority as he watched Carmen settle into her assigned seat. "At least some of us know how to travel honestly," he muttered to himself, making sure his own economy ticket was properly displayed in case anyone questioned his right to be there. The college student in seat 42E pulled out her phone to text her friends about the entertainment she had just witnessed. "OMG, just saw this middle-aged lady get totally called out for trying to steal a first-class seat," she typed quickly. "So awkward. She's sitting right next to me now, pretending nothing happened." Throughout the cabin, passengers were already incorporating Carmen's humiliation into their travel stories, the kind of amusing anecdotes they would share with friends and family about the interesting people they encountered while flying. She had become a cautionary tale about the importance of knowing one's place and respecting social boundaries, a reminder that trying to claim privileges you hadn't earned would always result in public embarrassment. But as the Boeing 767 prepared for departure from Denver International Airport, none of these smugly satisfied passengers had any way of knowing that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple seating dispute. They had seen a decorated military leader accept public humiliation with quiet grace, choosing dignity over confrontation even when she possessed the authority to end their mockery with a single word. The woman they had dismissed as a wannabe pretender was carrying credentials that would have silenced their laughter instantly, but Carmen Martinez had learned long ago that true strength sometimes meant allowing others to underestimate you. In a few hours, when their lives hung in the balance and their assumptions about heroism and expertise were shattered forever, they would understand exactly how wrong their judgments had been. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came 37 minutes into the flight, when Captain James Whitfield noticed an almost imperceptible tremor in the left engine's vibration pattern. What began as a subtle irregularity in the Boeing 767's normal cruise operation quickly cascaded into a series of mechanical failures that would test every system on the aircraft and push the crew beyond the limits of their training. At 37,000 feet over the Colorado Rockies, the left engine's high-pressure turbine began to disintegrate. The initial failure was invisible to passengers, a hairline crack in a titanium blade that had been weakened by thousands of thermal cycles. Within seconds, that crack propagated through the blade assembly, causing a catastrophic imbalance that sent vibrations throughout the engine core. The engine's sophisticated monitoring systems detected the anomaly immediately, but the cascade of failures was happening faster than any automated system could respond. In the cockpit, Captain Whitfield felt the vibration through his seat before any warning lights appeared on his instrument panel. 23 years of commercial flying had given him an intuitive sense of how aircraft should feel during normal operations, and the subtle wrongness in the engine's harmonics made his stomach clench with anticipation of trouble. First Officer David Reynolds was scanning the engine parameters on his display when the first amber warning light illuminated. "Captain, we're getting an engine vibration alert on number 1, Reynolds reported, his voice steady but tight with professional concern. "Vibration levels are climbing through the yellow band, approaching red line limits." Before Whitfield could respond, the situation exploded beyond containment. The disintegrating turbine blade fragments struck the engine's containment ring with devastating force, but the impact exceeded the design limits of the safety systems. Large chunks of high-velocity metal punched through the engine cowling and struck the aircraft's wing structure, severing hydraulic lines and electrical cables that controlled critical flight systems. The Boeing 767 lurched violently to the left as asymmetric thrust from the failing engine overwhelmed the autopilot's corrective capabilities. Emergency lighting bathed the cockpit in pulsing red as warning alarms began cascading across the instrument panel faster than the crew could acknowledge them. Engine fire warning, hydraulic pressure loss, electrical system failures, flight control anomalies. Each new alert adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. In the passenger cabin, the violent motion threw people against their seatbelts and sent loose items flying through the air. Drinks splashed across passengers, overhead bins rattled ominously, and the sickening smell of burning jet fuel began filtering through the ventilation system. The aircraft's motion was unlike anything most commercial passengers had ever experienced. Not the gentle turbulence of weather disturbance, but the violent, uncontrolled lurching of a machine fighting against fundamental mechanical failure. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain," Whitfield's voice came over the intercom, professionally calm despite the chaos in the cockpit. "We are experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will be making a precautionary descent. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we address this situation." But the careful understatement in his announcement couldn't mask the reality of what was happening. The left engine wasn't just malfunctioning, it was destroying itself in a cascade of metal fragments and burning fuel. Worse yet, the debris from the engine failure had damaged multiple aircraft systems that were essential for safe flight operations. The Boeing 767 was rapidly transforming from a sophisticated passenger transport into a partially controllable glider with 312 people aboard. First Officer Reynolds was working frantically through emergency checklists, but each procedure seemed to reveal another system that had been compromised by the engine explosion. "Captain, we've lost primary hydraulics, backup electrical systems are fluctuating, and the flight management computer is showing multiple sensor failures," he reported, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cockpit's air conditioning. "We're not getting reliable readings from half our instruments." The aircraft's autopilot disengaged with an attention-getting chime, forcing Whitfield to manually control a machine that was becoming increasingly difficult to fly. The left engine was now completely dead, creating massive drag and asymmetric thrust that wanted to pull the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Every control input required enormous physical effort as he fought against aerodynamic forces that were trying to tear the aircraft apart. In the passenger cabin, panic was beginning to spread like wildfire. Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell, who had been so confident and authoritative during the seating dispute, was now struggling to maintain her own composure as she helped terrified passengers with oxygen masks that had deployed automatically. Her professional training had prepared her for standard emergencies, but nothing in her experience had equipped her to deal with the level of system failures they were experiencing. "Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened," she announced over the cabin intercom, her voice betraying the fear she was trying to suppress. "We are working to resolve this situation as quickly as possible." But passengers could see through the aircraft's windows that resolve and training might not be enough to save them. Smoke was trailing from the left engine, and debris was still occasionally breaking away from the damaged cowling. The aircraft's motion was becoming increasingly erratic as Captain Whitfield fought to maintain control with degraded systems and asymmetric thrust. The businessman Marcus Rothwell, who had been so dismissive of Carmen Martinez's presence in first class, was now gripping his armrest with white knuckles as he stared out at the damaged engine. "This doesn't look like a precautionary anything," he said to Dr. Vivian Cross, his earlier smugness replaced by genuine terror. "That engine is completely destroyed." Dr. Cross, despite her medical training and professional experience with crisis situations, was equally shaken by the violence of the mechanical failure. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, watching debris continue to stream from the engine. "This is catastrophic damage." In the economy section, Carmen Martinez was experiencing the crisis from a very different perspective than the panicking passengers around her. While others saw terrifying chaos and incomprehensible mechanical failure, she was processing the aircraft's behavior through the lens of decades of aviation expertise. The specific pattern of vibrations, the particular sounds of the struggling engines, the way the aircraft was responding to control inputs. All of these details were providing her with a detailed analysis of exactly what had failed and what the crew was facing in their attempts to maintain control. The college student in seat 42E was crying as she tried to call her parents on her cell phone, despite the flight attendant's instructions to keep electronic devices turned off. "Mom, I think our plane is crashing," she sobbed into the phone. "The engine exploded and we're falling out of the sky." But Carmen knew they weren't falling, at least not yet. Captain Whitfield was doing an exceptional job maintaining control under impossible circumstances, but she could feel through the aircraft's motion that he was fighting a losing battle against cascading system failures. The Boeing 767 was still flyable, but barely, and each passing minute brought new complications as damaged systems continued to degrade. The real crisis wasn't just the engine failure. It was the combination of multiple system degradations that were pushing the aircraft beyond the limits of normal emergency procedures. Even the most experienced commercial pilots trained for single emergencies, not the kind of cascading failures that Carmen could recognize, were developing. In her years of military aviation operations, she had seen similar situations where technically competent crews were overwhelmed not by lack of skill, but by the sheer complexity of multiple simultaneous failures. As the Boeing 767 continued its emergency descent toward an uncertain outcome, Carmen realized that her anonymity and careful civilian disguise might be the only thing standing between 312 passengers and a disaster that would make headlines around the world. The question was whether she could continue to remain invisible while watching people die, or whether the time had come to reveal exactly who was sitting quietly in seat 42F. While the other passengers succumbed to panic and fear, Carmen Martinez displayed a series of subtle behaviors that would have immediately identified her as a trained aviation professional to anyone who knew what to look for. But in the chaos of the emergency, with people crying and praying around her, these quiet demonstrations of expertise went completely unnoticed by the terrified civilians who were focused only on their own survival. As the aircraft continued its violent motion and the smell of burning jet fuel grew stronger, Carmen's physical response was markedly different from everyone around her. While other passengers gripped their armrests with white knuckles and rigid posture, She maintained a relaxed but alert position that allowed her to feel every subtle change in the aircraft's behavior. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, not from any lack of awareness about the danger they faced, but from decades of training in managing physiological responses during aviation emergencies. The college student beside her was hyperventilating and sobbing into her cell phone, but Carmen was listening intently to sounds that the panicked passengers couldn't distinguish from general chaos. She could hear the specific whine of the right engine as it struggled to compensate for the complete loss of thrust from the left side. The pitch and intensity of that sound told her that Captain Whitfield was pushing the remaining engine beyond normal operating parameters, a necessary but risky decision that bought them control authority at the cost of potential secondary failures. When another violent lurch threw passengers against their seatbelts, Carmen instinctively braced herself with techniques she had learned during military ejection seat training. While others were thrown around helplessly, she moved with the aircraft's motion in a way that minimized impact and maintained her ability to observe and analyze what was happening. This wasn't luck or natural ability. It was the result of countless hours in flight simulators and actual aircraft, experiencing controlled emergencies as part of her military training. Her eyes tracked the emergency lighting patterns on the cabin ceiling with the systematic attention of someone who understood exactly what each flashing indicator meant. The sequence of red and amber lights told a story about which aircraft systems were failing and in what order, information that would be crucial for understanding the crew's options and limitations. Most passengers saw only frightening flashes of color, but Carmen was reading a detailed technical narrative about the progressive degradation of the Boeing 767's capabilities. When the oxygen masks had deployed, Carmen's response had been notably different from the passenger safety demonstration that everyone else was trying to remember. She secured her own mask with practiced efficiency, but then immediately began monitoring the oxygen flow rate and pressure by feeling the tension in the elastic straps and listening to the subtle hiss of gas flow. These weren't actions that civilian passengers would think to take, but they were standard procedures for aircrew members who needed to verify their life support systems were functioning properly. The most telling sign of her aviation background was how she was tracking the aircraft's position and trajectory without access to any navigation instruments. By observing the angle of sunlight through the windows, feeling the G-forces during turns, and timing the duration of their emergency descent, she was maintaining a rough but accurate picture of their location and heading. Every few minutes she would glance at her simple Timex watch and make mental calculations that were updating her estimate of their distance from potential emergency landing sites. When Captain Whitfield's voice came over the intercom again, this time with barely controlled tension, announcing that they were declaring an emergency and requesting priority handling from air traffic control, Carmen was already reaching into her messenger bag. To anyone watching, she appeared to be searching for tissues or medication, a reasonable response for someone feeling stressed during an emergency, but her fingers were actually locating specific items that most civilian passengers would never carry: a small handheld aviation radio, emergency frequency cards, and technical reference materials that weren't available to the general public. She didn't remove these items from her bag. Operational security habits developed over decades of classified work made her instinctively cautious about revealing capabilities that might raise questions. But having them accessible was providing her with options that she might need if the situation continued to deteriorate beyond the crew's ability to manage. The businessman in seat 41C, who was now openly terrified despite his earlier confidence, noticed Carmen's calm demeanor and mistook it for shock or denial. "Lady, I don't think you understand how serious this is," he said urgently, leaning across the aisle. That engine completely exploded. We could all die here. Carmen turned to look at him with an expression of calm assessment that seemed almost clinical in its detachment. The engine failure was catastrophic, but the aircraft is still controllable, she said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that was completely at odds with the panic around them. The crew is following proper emergency procedures. The probability of a successful emergency landing is approximately 73%, assuming no additional system failures in the next 18 minutes. The precision of her response and the technical terminology she used without thinking made the businessman stare at her in confusion. "How could you possibly know any of that?" he demanded. "Are you some kind of pilot or something?" But Carmen had already turned her attention back to monitoring the aircraft's behavior, leaving him to wonder how a middle-aged woman in economy class could speak about aviation emergencies with the confidence of someone who had managed them professionally. The interaction had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it provided a glimpse of the expertise she was carefully keeping hidden. Flight attendant Robert Kim was working his way through the cabin, checking on passengers and trying to maintain some semblance of order during the emergency. When he reached Carmen's row, he was struck by how composed she appeared compared to the other passengers. While everyone else was either crying, praying, or demanding answers he couldn't provide, she seemed almost professionally focused on something he couldn't identify. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right?" he asked, concerned that she might be experiencing shock or a medical emergency. "Do you need any assistance?" Carmen looked up at him with the same clinical assessment she had given the panicked businessman. "The cabin crew is handling the passenger management correctly," she said, her response again revealing familiarity with aviation terminology that didn't match her civilian appearance. "You should focus on the passengers who are experiencing medical distress from hyperventilation. Row 37 has someone who appears to be having a panic attack." Robert Kim found himself automatically following her suggestion before he realized that he was taking direction from a passenger and that her assessment of the cabin situation was remarkably accurate. When he looked back at her with confusion, Carmen had already returned her attention to whatever systematic observation she was conducting. In the cockpit, Captain Whitfield and First Officer Reynolds were discovering that their emergency was far more complex than any simulation they had ever experienced. The engine explosion had damaged multiple systems in ways that weren't covered by their standard emergency checklists, forcing them to improvise solutions while fighting to control an increasingly unstable aircraft. "We need to get this bird on the ground fast," Whitfield said through gritted teeth as he struggled with the flight controls, "but I'm not sure we can maintain control long enough to reach a suitable airport." Reynolds was cycling through their options on the navigation display, but every potential landing site seemed impossibly far given their current rate of system degradation. "Denver is behind us, Colorado Springs is marginal, and I'm not sure we can maintain altitude long enough to reach anything else." Neither of them knew that sitting quietly in seat 42F was someone who had spent her entire career solving exactly these types of impossible aviation problems, someone whose expertise in emergency operations management exceeded their own by several orders of magnitude. Carmen Martinez was listening to their struggle through the thin cockpit door and calculating solutions that wouldn't occur to commercial pilots who had never operated in combat environments where aircraft continued flying long after they should have been unflyable. The time was rapidly approaching when she would have to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed anonymity and watching 312 people die in a disaster that her intervention could prevent. The moment of decision arrived when Captain Whitfield's voice crackled over the intercom for the third time, and even his careful professional training couldn't mask the desperation that was beginning to creep into his tone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing multiple system failures and will be attempting an emergency landing. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures immediately. The word attempting sent a chill through the passenger cabin that was far more terrifying than any of the previous announcements. Commercial pilots were trained never to suggest uncertainty about successful outcomes, and the fact that Whitfield had chosen that particular word told everyone aboard that he wasn't confident they would survive the next 30 minutes. Carmen felt the aircraft's behavior change again as the pilots reduced power and began configuring for an emergency approach to what she calculated was probably Colorado Springs Airport, the only viable option given their current position and rate of descent. But she could feel through the control inputs that Captain Whitfield was fighting increasingly severe handling problems. The asymmetric thrust from the dead engine was creating aerodynamic moments that were requiring constant corrective inputs, and she knew from experience that pilot fatigue would soon become a factor in their ability to maintain control. More critically, she could hear subtle changes in the right engine's operation that suggested it was being stressed beyond design limits. The engine was running hot and fast as Whitfield pushed it to compensate for the complete loss of power from the left side, but that level of operation couldn't be sustained indefinitely without risking a second catastrophic failure. If they lost the remaining engine, the Boeing 767 would become a glider with insufficient altitude to reach any airport. Around her, the panic was reaching new levels as passengers realized that their situation was deteriorating rather than improving. Flight attendants were moving through the cabin with forced calm, demonstrating emergency procedures and checking seatbelts, but their own fear was becoming increasingly visible despite their professional training. Jessica Hartwell, who had been so confident and authoritative when enforcing seating protocols, was now struggling to maintain her composure as she helped passengers assume crash positions. Her hands were shaking as she demonstrated the proper brace posture, and her voice cracked when she tried to reassure a crying child that everything would be all right. "I need all passengers to listen carefully," Jessica announced over the cabin intercom, her professional mask beginning to slip. "We will be landing in approximately 15 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are tightened, tray tables are up and locked, and seats are in their full upright position. When I give the command, assume the brace position and remain in that position until we come to a complete stop." But Carmen could tell from the aircraft's motion and the sound of the struggling engine that they had considerably less than 15 minutes before the situation became unrecoverable. She estimated they had perhaps 8 to 10 minutes of controlled flight remaining before either the remaining engine failed or the accumulating damage to the flight control systems made the aircraft impossible to handle. The businessman who had spoken to her earlier was now openly weeping, clutching a photograph of what appeared to be his family while muttering prayers in a language Carmen didn't recognize. The college student beside her had given up trying to call her parents and was simply staring out the window at the damaged engine with the blank expression of someone who had accepted that she was about to die. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Vivian Cross, the physician who had been so dismissive of Carmen's presence in first class, was having what appeared to be a panic attack despite her medical training. She was hyperventilating and gripping her armrest so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. All of her professional composure dissolved in the face of imminent mortality. It was the sight of little Amanda Torres in row 38 that finally broke through Carmen's resolve to remain anonymous. The 8-year-old girl was traveling alone as an unaccompanied minor, and she was crying for her mother with the heartbreaking desperation of a child who didn't understand why the adults around her couldn't fix the terrible thing that was happening. Flight attendant Robert Kim was trying to comfort her, but his own fear was making him ineffective at providing the reassurance she needed. Carmen unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, knowing that this single action would irrevocably end her carefully maintained anonymity. But watching people die when she possessed the knowledge and authority to save them was not an option that her training and conscience would allow her to choose. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately," Robert Kim called out as he saw her moving toward the front of the aircraft. "We are preparing for emergency landing and all passengers must remain seated." But Carmen continued walking forward with the steady, purposeful gait of someone who had made an irreversible decision. Other passengers looked at her with confusion and irritation. How could anyone be so selfish as to ignore safety procedures during an emergency? What could possibly be so important that she would risk everyone's safety by moving around the cabin? Jessica Hartwell saw her approach and felt a surge of anger that temporarily overcame her fear. This was the same passenger who had tried to steal a first-class seat, and now she was violating emergency procedures when people's lives were at stake. "Ma'am, I am ordering you to return to your seat," she said sharply. "You are endangering yourself and other passengers by moving around during an emergency." Carmen stopped directly in front of the flight attendant and spoke in a voice that was completely different from the quiet, apologetic tone she had used during the seating dispute. This was the voice of command authority, calm and certain and absolutely uncompromising. "My name is Admiral Carmen Martinez, United States Air Force," she said clearly, her words carrying through the cabin despite the noise of the struggling engines and crying passengers. "I need to speak with your captain immediately. This aircraft is approximately 6 minutes away from unrecoverable failure, and I have the training and authority to help prevent that outcome." The entire cabin fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of the aircraft's distress. Even the crying passengers stopped their sobbing as the implications of what they had just heard began to register. Jessica Hartwell stared at Carmen with an expression of complete shock, her mind struggling to process how the unremarkable woman she had humiliated earlier could possibly be making such an extraordinary claim. "I don't understand," Jessica stammered. "You're just a passenger. Your ticket shows you work for a consulting firm in Virginia." Carmen reached into her messenger bag and produced a military identification card with security, clearances that Jessica had never seen before. The photograph matched the woman standing in front of her, but the rank and credentials listed on the card belonged to someone who should have been traveling on military aircraft, not sitting in economy class on commercial flights. "My civilian cover story is irrelevant to our current situation," Carmen said with patient authority. "What is relevant is that I have 30 years of experience managing aviation emergencies, significantly more complex than what we're facing today. Your pilots are competent, but they're trained for single-system failures, not cascading emergencies with multiple compromised systems." The passengers around them were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus Rothwell, who had mocked Carmen's presence in first class, was staring at her with dawning comprehension. Dr. Vivian Cross had stopped hyperventilating and was listening with the focused attention of someone realizing that her assumptions about heroism and expertise had been completely wrong. "You need to get me to that cockpit," Carmen continued, her voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had commanded life-and-death situations for decades. "Because if Captain Whitfield continues trying to fly this approach with his current configuration and power settings, we're going to lose the remaining engine in approximately 4 minutes, and at that point, everyone on this aircraft will die." Jessica Hartwell looked at the military identification card, then at the calm determination in Carmen's eyes. and realized that she was faced with a decision that would define not only her career, but the survival of everyone aboard Flight 891. Behind the cockpit door, she could hear Captain Whitfield struggling with increasingly unresponsive controls, his voice tight with the strain of fighting a losing battle against mechanical failure and aerodynamic forces that were overwhelming his training and experience. The time for protocol and procedure had run out. The time for extraordinary measures had arrived. Jessica Hartwell's hand trembled as she reached for the cockpit door, the military identification card still clutched in her other palm, like a lifeline she didn't fully understand. The weight of 312 lives pressed down on her as she made the decision that would either save everyone aboard Flight 891 or add her own violation of security protocols to the disaster that seemed increasingly inevitable. "Captain Whitfield," she called through the intercom, her voice barely steady. "We have a passenger who claims to be a military officer. She says she can help with the emergency." The response from the cockpit was immediate and sharp with frustration. "Jessica, we don't have time for passenger suggestions right now. We're fighting to keep this bird in the air, and we need to concentrate on—" "Sir," Jessica interrupted, something she had never done in 8 years of flying. "With the airline. She has military credentials. Admiral Carmen Martinez, United States Air Force. She says you have approximately 4 minutes before the remaining engine fails." The cockpit fell silent except for the ominous sounds of struggling systems and warning alarms. Through the thin door, Carmen could hear the rapid conversation between Captain Whitfield and First Officer Reynolds as they processed this unexpected information while simultaneously fighting to control their deteriorating aircraft. "Did she say Admiral Martinez?" Reynolds's voice was barely audible through the door, but Carmen caught the note of recognition in his tone. "Jesus Christ, Jimmy, that's Ghost 6. She's the one who saved the entire 34th Squadron over Syria 3 years ago." Captain Whitfield's response carried a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. "That's impossible. Ghost 6 disappeared after the Syria incident. She's supposed to be retired, maybe dead. There's no way she's sitting in economy class on our aircraft." But even as he spoke, Whitfield was reaching for the cockpit door release. In the 3 minutes since the engine explosion, every decision he had made had been reactive, responding to cascading failures with procedures that weren't designed for the level of system damage they were experiencing. If there was even a possibility that someone with superior knowledge was available to help, he couldn't afford to ignore it. The cockpit door opened and Carmen stepped into the flight deck with the calm assurance of someone entering familiar territory. But what she saw there confirmed her worst fears about their situation. The instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree of warning lights, with red and amber indicators showing failures across multiple critical systems. Captain Whitfield's shirt was soaked with sweat from the physical effort of controlling the aircraft, and First Officer Reynolds was cycling desperately through emergency checklists that clearly weren't providing solutions to their complex problems. "Captain, I'm Admiral Martinez," Carmen said, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision. "I need a 30-second brief on your current status and configuration." Whitfield looked at her with the expression of a drowning man who had just been thrown a rope but wasn't sure if it would hold his weight. "Engine 1 is completely destroyed. We've lost primary hydraulics. Electrical systems are degraded, and we're burning fuel at twice normal rate trying to maintain altitude with asymmetric thrust. Colorado Springs is our nearest option, but I'm not sure we can maintain control long enough to get there." Carmen's eyes swept across the instrument panel, absorbing information at a rate that surprised both pilots. Her training in complex aviation emergencies allowed her to process the multiple failures and understand their interconnected effects in ways that commercial aviation procedures didn't address. "Your right engine is—" running at 112% of rated power, she said, pointing to a specific gauge. That's unsustainable. You're going to experience catastrophic failure in the next 3 to 4 minutes if you don't reduce power immediately. If I reduce power, we lose altitude and can't reach the airport, Whitfield protested, his voice tight with the impossible choices he was facing. If you don't reduce power, the engine explodes and we become a glider at insufficient altitude to reach anything, Carmen replied with the calm certainty of someone who had managed similar situations. But there's a third option that your commercial training hasn't covered. She moved to the center console and began making rapid calculations on the flight management computer, her fingers dancing across keys with the practiced efficiency of someone who had operated similar systems for decades. You're going to configure for a combat emergency approach. Maximum descent rate, minimum power settings, and we're going to use ground effect to extend our glide range beyond normal parameters. First Officer Reynolds stared at her in confusion. Ground effect at this altitude? That's impossible. Not at this altitude, Carmen explained, continuing her calculations. We're going to descend at maximum rate to 500 feet above ground level, then use ground effect cushioning to extend our glide distance. It's a technique developed for damaged military aircraft, but it's never been attempted with a commercial transport. Captain Whitfield felt a mixture of hope and terror at what she was proposing. That's completely outside our training parameters. If we misjudge the approach by even a few seconds, everyone dies, Carmen finished calmly. But if we continue your current approach, everyone dies anyway when the remaining engine fails. This technique gives us approximately a 67% probability of successful landing versus 0% with conventional procedures. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear, but the technique Carmen was proposing required flying skills and risk tolerance that went far beyond commercial aviation training. Whitfield would have to trust not only her expertise, but his own ability to execute maneuvers he had never practiced in an aircraft that was barely controllable. I need you to transfer control to me, Carmen said quietly, her hand already reaching for the captain's yoke. You're fatigued from fighting the asymmetric thrust, and this approach requires precision that can't be maintained with degraded physical capabilities. The request was so far outside normal protocols that both pilots stared at her in shock. Commercial aircraft had 2 pilots specifically to prevent single-point failures in human judgment, and transferring control to a passenger, even a military passenger, violated every safety protocol they had ever learned. Ma'am, I can't transfer control of a commercial aircraft to someone who isn't rated on this type, Whitfield said, though his voice carried more desperation than conviction. Even if you are who you say you are, you're not current on Boeing 767 systems. Carmen looked at him with an expression that combined understanding with absolute authority. Captain, I've flown emergency approaches in aircraft significantly more damaged than this one, with systems you've never heard of, in combat situations where ground fire was actively trying to kill us. The Boeing 767 is actually one of the simpler aircraft I'm qualified to operate. She reached into her messenger bag and produced a worn leather wallet containing pilot ratings and certifications that made both men's jaws drop. Commercial, military, experimental, and type ratings for aircraft that were classified above their security clearance levels. The documentation was genuine and current, showing proficiency in aircraft systems that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology. More importantly, Carmen continued, I've successfully executed this exact emergency approach technique 17 times in combat situations. The survival rate was 100% for aircrew and passengers. Your choice is to maintain control and watch everyone die in 3 minutes when your engine fails, or trust someone whose entire career has been built around solving impossible aviation problems. Captain Whitfield looked at his struggling flight controls, then at the fuel gauges showing their reserves disappearing at an unsustainable rate, then at the instrument panel filled with warnings about systems that were failing faster than he could address them. The choice was between certain death with conventional procedures or uncertain survival with techniques he had never imagined. "Okay," he said quietly, his hands moving away from the controls. "Admiral Martinez, you have the aircraft." Carmen's hands closed around the flight controls with the sure grip of someone who had been born to fly. Immediately, the aircraft's handling became more precise as she compensated for the asymmetric thrust with control inputs that reflected decades of experience with damaged aircraft. The violent lurching that had been exhausting Captain Whitfield smoothed into controlled flight as she demonstrated mastery of aerodynamic principles that went far beyond commercial aviation training. "First Officer Reynolds, I need you to configure for emergency approach. Flaps to 15 degrees, landing gear up until final, and prepare for descent rate of 4,000 feet per minute," she ordered, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had commanded complex operations under life-threatening pressure. Both pilots began following her instructions with the automatic response of aircrew, who recognized superior expertise when they encountered it. In the passenger cabin behind them, 312 people continued to pray and cry, unaware that their survival now depended on techniques developed in military combat zones and a woman whose existence they had dismissed as completely ordinary just 30 minutes earlier. The transformation in the cockpit was immediate and dramatic. Within seconds of Carmen taking control of the aircraft, the violent lurching and unstable flight characteristics that had been exhausting Captain Whitfield smoothed into precise, controlled flight. Her hands on the yoke moved with the unconscious competence of someone who had spent decades flying aircraft in conditions far more challenging than anything commercial aviation normally encountered. But it was her voice that provided the most striking evidence of her true identity and capabilities. When she began transmitting on the emergency frequencies, the calm authority in her tone was completely different from the quiet, apologetic passenger who had been forced to move from first class just hours earlier. "Denver Center, this is Skyline Flight 891 declaring emergency," Carmen transmitted, her voice carrying the crisp precision of military communications protocol. "We have experienced catastrophic engine failure with multiple system degradation, requesting immediate priority handling and emergency services, standing by at Colorado Springs." The response from air traffic control came immediately, but it was the tone of the controller's voice that revealed something extraordinary was happening. "Skyline 891, Denver Center copies your emergency. We have emergency services alerted and priority routing cleared. Please advise souls on board and fuel remaining." "Denver Center, Skyline 891, 312 souls on board. Approximately 14 minutes fuel remaining at current consumption rate," Carmen responded. Then she added something that made both pilots in the cockpit freeze with recognition, requesting glass corridor clearance for combat emergency approach procedures. The radio fell silent for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in aviation communications. Glass corridor was a classified military protocol that didn't exist in civilian aviation procedures. The fact that Carmen had requested it and used the proper authentication codes meant that someone in the Denver Center facility was now running security checks that would reveal exactly who was flying Skyline Flight 891. When the controller's voice returned, it carried a completely different tone, the respect and deference reserved for the highest levels of military authority. "Skyline 891, Denver Center, glass corridor authentication confirmed. You are cleared for any approach profile you require. All civilian traffic is being diverted clear of your route." Captain Whitfield and First Officer Reynolds exchanged stunned glances. Glass corridor clearance meant that every commercial aircraft within a 50-mile radius was being immediately diverted to alternative airports, that military air traffic controllers with top-secret clearances had taken over their handling, and that someone with extraordinary authority was now flying their aircraft. The level of coordination required for such clearance could only be authorized by individuals whose names appeared on classified lists that neither commercial pilot had ever seen. "Admiral," Captain Whitfield said quietly, "what exactly is glass corridor clearance?" Carmen continued making control inputs while she answered, her attention never wavering from the precise aircraft handling that was keeping them airborne. "It's emergency authorization for military aircraft to operate outside normal flight parameters when civilian lives are at risk," she explained. "It means we can now use approach techniques that would normally violate civilian aviation regulations." What she didn't explain was that glass corridor clearance was only available to a handful of military officers whose identities were so sensitive that revealing them required approval from the Pentagon. The fact that Denver Center had authenticated her request meant that encrypted communications were now flowing between air traffic control, the Department of Defense, and intelligence agencies whose existence most people would never know about. In the passenger cabin, word was spreading that something extraordinary had happened in the cockpit. Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell had returned from the flight deck with an expression of shock and awe that she couldn't hide despite her professional training. When passengers demanded to know what was happening, she struggled to find words to explain what she had witnessed. "The woman who was moved from first class," she announced over the cabin intercom, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's a military officer. Admiral Martinez has taken control of the aircraft and is working with the pilots to get us safely on the ground." The reaction in the cabin was immediate and profound. The businessman Marcus Rothwell, who had mocked Carmen's attempt to sit in first class, felt a wave of shame and amazement that made his earlier smugness seem petty and foolish. "The woman I made fun of," he said to Dr. Vivian Cross, "she's actually an admiral?" Dr. Cross was experiencing her own moment of revelation as she remembered her dismissive comments about Carmen's practical clothing and worn messenger bag. "We judged her completely wrong," she whispered. "Everything we thought we knew about her was wrong." The elderly woman, Mrs. Dorothy Blackstone, who had lectured about people knowing their proper place, was now staring toward the cockpit with an expression of humble amazement. "Harold," she said to her husband, "that woman we thought didn't belong in first class. She's saving our lives." But the most dramatic reaction came from the military contractor in seat 3D, retired Air Force Master Sergeant Michael Torres, who had served in combat zones where Ghost 6's reputation was legendary. When he heard Jessica's announcement about Admiral Martinez, his face went pale with recognition. "Jesus Christ," he said loudly, enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "That's Ghost 6. I was in Syria when she saved the entire 34th Fighter Squadron. She talked 12 pilots through an electronic warfare ambush that should have killed them all." Other passengers turned to stare at him, demanding explanations they couldn't quite comprehend. Torres tried to explain the significance of what they had just learned, but the classified nature of most military operations meant he could only share fragments of stories that sounded almost mythical. "She's the most decorated electronic warfare officer in Air Force history," he continued, his voice filled with awe. "When military pilots are in trouble anywhere in the world, Ghost 6 is the voice they pray they'll hear on the radio. She's saved more aircrew than any individual in modern military history." The young college student who had been sitting next to Carmen was crying again, but these were tears of amazement rather than fear. "She was sitting right next to me," she said repeatedly. "The most famous military pilot in the world was sitting right next to me, and I had no idea." In the cockpit, Carmen was demonstrating exactly why her reputation was legendary. The combat emergency approach technique she was executing required flying skills that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. She had reduced power on the remaining engine to sustainable levels, accepting the corresponding loss of altitude in exchange for preventing a second catastrophic failure. The Boeing 767 was now descending at nearly 4,000 feet per minute, a rate that would have been terrifying to commercial pilots, but was perfectly controlled under Carmen's hands. She was calculating approach angles, fuel consumption, and aircraft performance margins with the intuitive precision of someone who had executed similar approaches dozens of times in conditions where surface-to-air missiles were actively trying to shoot her down. "Admiral, our descent rate is outside normal parameters," First Officer Reynolds observed, trying to hide his nervousness about the aggressive approach profile. "Normal parameters don't apply when you have asymmetric thrust and degraded systems," Carmen replied calmly. "We're going to use ground effect to extend our glide range, but that requires precise energy management that can't be achieved with conservative approach techniques." Through the radio, they could hear Denver Center coordinating with Colorado Springs Airport to prepare for their arrival. Emergency vehicles were positioning along the runway, medical personnel were being alerted, and air traffic control was clearing the entire airspace for their approach. The level of preparation being undertaken indicated that everyone involved understood they were witnessing an emergency response by someone whose capabilities exceeded normal aviation expertise. Captain Whitfield watched Carmen's control inputs with growing amazement. Every adjustment she made to power, attitude, and configuration was perfectly timed and precisely executed. The aircraft was responding to her touch with a stability and precision that made their earlier struggles seem amateurish by comparison. "How long have you been flying?" he asked quietly, recognizing that he was in the presence of someone whose skills far exceeded his own. Carmen glanced at the altimeter as they passed through 15,000 feet in their controlled descent. 32 years, she answered, but most of that time was in situations where perfect execution wasn't optional. It was the difference between coming home alive or not coming home at all. The authentication of her identity and capabilities was now complete, but the most dangerous part of their emergency was still ahead of them. In 6 minutes, they would attempt a landing that had never been tried with a commercial transport aircraft, using techniques developed in military combat zones with the lives of 312 people dependent on the precision of a woman who had chosen to remain anonymous until the moment when anonymity became impossible. The final approach to Colorado Springs Airport unfolded like a masterclass in precision flying that neither Captain Whitfield nor First Officer Reynolds had ever witnessed. Carmen's execution of the combat emergency approach was so far beyond normal commercial aviation procedures that both pilots found themselves watching with the fascination of students observing a master craftsman demonstrate techniques they had never imagined possible. At 8,000 feet, Carmen began the most critical phase of the approach, a controlled descent that required managing energy and momentum with mathematical precision. The Boeing 767 was still losing fuel at an unsustainable rate due to damaged fuel lines, but she had calculated their consumption down to the gallon and knew they had exactly enough remaining fuel to reach the runway with perhaps 30 seconds of margin. Colorado Springs Tower, Skyline 891, requesting emergency approach clearance, Carmen transmitted, her voice maintaining the same calm authority that had characterized all her communications, despite the extraordinary complexity of what she was attempting. Be advised, we will be executing a non-standard approach profile with ground effect extension. All emergency vehicles should be positioned for potential runway overrun. The response from the tower controller revealed that word of their situation had reached the highest levels of aviation authority. Skyline 891, Colorado Springs Tower, you are cleared for emergency approach any runway, any direction. We have emergency services standing by and all traffic cleared from the area. The airport is yours, Admiral. The use of her military rank by civilian air traffic control indicated that glass corridor protocols were now fully activated and that controllers with top secret clearances were managing their approach. This level of coordination existed for only the most sensitive military operations, and its activation for a commercial aircraft emergency demonstrated the extraordinary nature of their situation. In the passenger cabin, the reality of their circumstances was becoming clear to everyone aboard. The aircraft's steep descent angle was unlike anything most commercial passengers had ever experienced. But instead of the panic that might have been expected, there was an almost reverent quiet as people realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Flight attendant Robert Kim was moving through the cabin, ensuring that passengers were properly secured for the emergency landing, but his own amazement at their situation was evident in his voice when he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach under the guidance of Admiral Martinez. Please ensure your seatbelts are tightened and assume the brace position when instructed. Marcus Rothwell, the businessman who had so dismissively mocked Carmen's presence in first class, was now watching the approach through his window with an expression of profound humility. The woman he had assumed was a social climber trying to steal privileges she hadn't earned was actually someone whose authority exceeded that of anyone he had ever encountered in his corporate world. "I can't believe we made fun of her," he said to Dr. Vivian Cross, shame evident in his voice. "We actually laughed at someone who was probably more qualified to fly this plane than the pilots themselves." Dr. Cross was experiencing her own reckoning with the assumptions she had made based on Carmen's unremarkable appearance and practical clothing. As a physician, she prided herself on careful observation and accurate assessment, but she had completely failed to recognize the expertise that was sitting quietly beside her. Everything about her that we thought was ordinary was actually operational security, she realized aloud. The simple clothes, the economy ticket, the worn messenger bag, it was all designed to make her invisible. We saw exactly what she wanted us to see. At 5,000 feet, Carmen began demonstrating why her technique was called a combat emergency approach, instead of the gradual, stabilized descent that commercial pilots were trained to execute. She was flying a steep, constantly changing approach that required continuous recalculation of energy management and aircraft performance. Every control input was precisely timed to maintain the narrow envelope between too much speed and too little altitude. "Admiral, we're showing ground proximity warnings," First Officer Reynolds observed, trying to keep the nervousness out of his voice as they descended far below normal approach parameters. "Ignore the warnings," Carmen replied calmly. "Ground proximity systems are programmed for conventional approaches. We're going to be flying at altitudes that will trigger every warning system on the aircraft, but we'll be in complete control throughout the approach." Captain Whitfield was beginning to understand the sophistication of the technique she was executing. By maintaining higher speed and steeper descent angles than normal procedures allowed, she was converting altitude into energy that could be used for last-minute adjustments. It was a method that required split-second timing and absolute precision, but it provided options that conventional approaches couldn't offer. At 3,000 feet, the damaged right engine began showing signs of the stress that Carmen had predicted. Oil pressure was fluctuating and exhaust gas temperatures were climbing toward dangerous levels. But instead of the catastrophic failure that would have occurred with Captain Whitfield's higher power settings, the engine was continuing to operate within barely acceptable parameters. "The engine's not going to last much longer," Reynolds observed, monitoring the degrading parameters with growing concern. "It doesn't need to," Carmen replied with certainty that came from precise calculation rather than hope. "We need approximately 90 more seconds of power, and it will provide exactly that if we maintain current settings." At 2,000 feet, Carmen began the most dangerous part of the approach, the transition into ground effect. This was the technique that made combat emergency approaches possible, but it required flying closer to the ground than any commercial pilot was trained to attempt. The margin for error was measured in seconds and feet, with no possibility for recovery if the calculations were wrong. "All passengers, assume brace position immediately," she announced over the cabin intercom, her voice carrying both authority and reassurance. "We will be touching down in approximately 60 seconds. The Boeing 767 swept over the approach lights at an altitude that made both pilots close their eyes involuntarily. Carmen was flying manually, without autopilot assistance, maintaining control of an aircraft with degraded systems at altitudes where any mistake would result in immediate ground contact. But her hands on the controls were steady, her control inputs precise, and her voice remained calm as she called out altitude and speed to her crew. At 500 feet, the ground effect began to take hold, the cushion of compressed air between the aircraft and the ground that would allow them to maintain controlled flight at lower speeds than normal aerodynamics would permit. Carmen's timing was perfect, arriving at exactly the right altitude with exactly the right speed to use this aerodynamic phenomenon to extend their glide. "Incredible," Captain Whitfield whispered as he watched the airspeed indicators behave in ways that contradicted everything he thought he knew about aircraft performance. "The aircraft is flying in conditions that should be impossible." At 200 feet, Carmen executed the final phase of the approach, a carefully controlled transition from ground effect flight to touchdown that required bleeding off speed at exactly the right rate while maintaining directional control of an aircraft with asymmetric thrust. The runway threshold passed beneath them at an altitude that would have been terrifying to commercial pilots, but Carmen's calculations had been perfect. The main landing gear touched the runway with barely perceptible firmness, followed immediately by the nose gear as Carmen demonstrated a landing technique that achieved what should have been impossible: a smooth touchdown from an approach that had violated every conventional procedure. The Boeing 767 rolled down the runway under perfect control as she applied reverse thrust and wheel brakes with the same precision that had characterized every moment of the approach. Skyline 891, Colorado Springs Tower. "Welcome to Colorado Springs," the controller transmitted, his voice filled with awe at what he had just witnessed. "Emergency services are standing by, but it appears you won't be needing them." As the aircraft came to a stop on the runway, 312 passengers erupted in applause and tears of relief. But their celebration was mixed with profound amazement at what they had just experienced. They had witnessed a demonstration of flying skills that existed at the very highest levels of aviation expertise, executed by someone who had remained completely invisible until the moment when her intervention became the difference between life and death. In the cockpit, Captain Whitfield and First Officer Reynolds sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just experienced. They had watched someone execute procedures they had never imagined, using techniques that weren't taught in any commercial aviation program, with results that had saved every life aboard their aircraft. "Admiral," Captain Whitfield said quietly, "I've been flying for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did. How many people know how to fly like that?" Carmen was already beginning the process of returning to her civilian anonymity, her voice resuming the quiet tone that had characterized her earlier interactions. "Very few," she replied simply, "and most of us prefer to remain invisible until we're needed." The crisis was over, but the revelation of who had been sitting quietly in seat 42F would transform every passenger's understanding of heroism, expertise, and the extraordinary capabilities that sometimes hide behind the most ordinary appearances. As emergency vehicles surrounded the Boeing 767 and passengers began the process of safely evacuating the aircraft, the full magnitude of Carmen Martinez's hidden identity began to emerge through conversations, phone calls, and encrypted communications that revealed a military career so distinguished and classified that most of the details would never become public knowledge. The first indication of her true background came when retired Air Force Master Sergeant Michael Torres approached her during the evacuation process, his face filled with an emotion that bordered on reverence. Torres had served in forward operating bases across the Middle East, and Ghost 6's reputation was legendary among aircrew who had operated in combat zones. "Admiral Martinez," he said, standing at rigid attention despite being in civilian clothes. "Master Sergeant Torres, retired 34th Fighter Squadron. I was at Balad Air Base when you saved Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's flight over Mosul. Ma'am, you talked him through a surface-to-air missile engagement that should have killed his entire formation." Carmen's response revealed the weight of memories she carried from her military service. "Sergeant Torres," she acknowledged quietly, "I remember that mission. How is Colonel Richardson?" "He retired as a brigadier general, ma'am. He still tells that story at every military gathering he attends. Says Ghost 6's voice in his headset was like hearing an angel guide him home." Other passengers overheard this exchange, and the fragments of military operations they were learning about painted a picture of someone whose career had been defined by saving lives in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. But Torres's knowledge represented only a tiny fraction of Carmen's actual service record, most of which remained classified at levels that required special congressional authorization to access. Dr. Vivian Cross, whose medical background had made her curious about Carmen's apparent calm during the crisis, approached with questions that revealed her growing understanding of what they had witnessed. "Admiral, when you were managing our emergency, you displayed a level of situational awareness that seemed almost supernatural. How do you maintain that kind of composure under such extreme pressure?" Carmen's answer provided insight into training regimens that existed far beyond normal military education. Combat aviation operations require processing information and making decisions at speeds that don't allow for emotional responses, she explained. When you're coordinating fighter intercepts while enemy forces are actively trying to jam your communications and shoot down your aircraft, managing a commercial aviation emergency becomes a relatively straightforward problem-solving exercise. What she didn't explain was that her specific training had included psychological conditioning techniques developed by military psychologists for personnel who would be operating in the most high-stress environments the military could create. Her calm demeanor wasn't natural talent. It was the result of years of systematic desensitization to crisis situations that would overwhelm most people. Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell, who was grappling with her own guilt over how she had treated Carmen, learned additional details about her passenger's background when she overheard a phone conversation between Carmen and someone at the Pentagon. The conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of technical military jargon that civilian ears couldn't follow, but certain phrases revealed the scope of her authority and expertise. "Yes, sir, glass corridor protocols were fully effective," Carmen was saying, into a secure satellite phone that she had produced from her messenger bag. "Commercial crew performed adequately. Once proper procedures were implemented, no, sir, operational security was maintained until intervention became necessary for passenger survival." The person on the other end of the conversation was clearly someone with extraordinary authority, because Carmen's responses carried the deference she would only show to superior officers at the very highest levels of military command. When the conversation concluded, Jessica worked up the courage to approach her with an apology that came from genuine remorse. "Admiral Martinez, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened with the seating," she began. "I treated you with disrespect that was completely inappropriate, but more than that, I failed to recognize someone whose service to our country deserves the highest respect." Carmen's response revealed the grace and humility that had characterized her approach to both military service and civilian life. "Ms. Hartwell, you were following proper procedures with the information available to you. Operational security requirements mean that my background isn't visible to civilian personnel, and your crew performed excellently once you understood the actual situation." But Jessica's curiosity about Carmen's background led to conversations with other passengers that gradually revealed fragments of her service record that painted a picture of extraordinary accomplishment and sacrifice. The canvas messenger bag that she had dismissed as shabby and inappropriate for first-class travel actually contained communications equipment and reference materials that represented decades of operational experience in the most sensitive military operations. Captain James Whitfield, who had experienced firsthand Carmen's flying skills and command presence, was conducting his own investigation into her background through aviation networks that connected commercial and military pilots. The information he discovered left him stunned at the level of expertise that had been sitting quietly in economy class throughout their flight. "She's not just any admiral," he explained to First Officer Reynolds as they completed their post-flight debriefing with investigators from the Federal Aviation Administration and National Transportation Safety Board. Admiral Carmen Martinez commanded the 552nd Air Control Wing, the AWACS command center that coordinates air operations across entire combat theaters. She was responsible for managing fighter intercepts, ground support missions, and electronic warfare operations for thousands of aircrew operating in hostile territory. The investigation into Flight 891's emergency was revealing details about Carmen's intervention that demonstrated capabilities far beyond what either pilot had realized during the crisis. The combat emergency approach technique she had executed was not just unconventional, it was a procedure that existed in classified military manuals that most commercial pilots would never see, developed for situations where normal approach procedures would result in certain death. Reynolds was struggling to process the implications of what they had experienced. She flew an approach that doesn't exist in civilian aviation, using techniques that we've never heard of, and made it look routine. How many people in the world can do something like that? The answer to that question was emerging through the FAA investigation and consultations with military aviation experts. Combat emergency approaches had been successfully executed fewer than 50 times in military history, always by pilots with extraordinary training and experience operating in combat zones where conventional procedures were inadequate. Carmen's 17 successful executions of this technique represented more than one-third of all successful attempts in military aviation history. But the most remarkable aspect of Carmen's background was not the technical expertise she had demonstrated, but the personal cost of the service that had prepared her for situations like Flight 891. The Syria mission that Master Sergeant Torres had referenced was part of a larger operation where Carmen had coordinated the rescue of downed aircrew while operating under intense enemy fire, saving dozens of lives but losing her closest friend and colleague in the process. Technical Sergeant Lisa Wong, Carmen's fellow AWACS operator and closest friend, had been killed when their aircraft experienced explosive decompression during a mission that Carmen had been commanding. The official investigation had cleared Carmen of any responsibility for the accident, but the guilt and trauma of losing someone she considered a sister had driven her from military service into the civilian anonymity she had been maintaining until today. Her retirement from active duty had been accompanied by commendations and decorations that recognized her as one of the most effective combat aviation commanders in military history, but also by personal grief that had made continued service impossible. The consulting firm in Virginia where she had been working was actually a cover assignment that allowed her to maintain her security clearances while transitioning to civilian life. Her decision to fly commercial airlines under civilian cover was part of an operational security protocol designed to protect officers whose knowledge and experience made them targets for foreign intelligence services. Everything about her appearance and behavior had been carefully designed to make her invisible to anyone who might recognize her true identity and capabilities. As passengers shared their stories of the emergency with family members and media representatives, a picture emerged of someone who had sacrificed a distinguished military career because of personal trauma, only to find herself thrust back into a situation where her unique expertise was the difference between life and death for 312 innocent people. The woman who had quietly accepted humiliation and mockery for trying to sit in first class was revealed to be someone who had commanded air operations across entire war zones, whose voice on military radios had guided thousands of aircrew safely home from combat missions, and whose expertise in aviation emergency management exceeded that of any civilian pilot in commercial aviation. But perhaps the most telling detail about Carmen Martinez's character was what happened next. How she chose to handle the recognition and attention that inevitably followed her life-saving intervention aboard Flight 891. 6 months after Flight 891's emergency landing at Colorado Springs, Carmen Martinez had once again vanished into anonymity, but this time her disappearance was by design rather than default. The woman who had saved 312 lives with techniques that existed at the very highest levels of military aviation had deliberately chosen to return to obscurity, but her impact continued to ripple through the lives of everyone she had touched and the systems she had helped to improve. The official record of the incident, filed with the Federal Aviation Administration and National Transportation Safety Board, was remarkably sanitized. The documents described a successful emergency landing following catastrophic engine failure, executed by qualified flight crew with assistance from a passenger with relevant military aviation experience. No mention was made of glass corridor protocols, combat emergency approaches, or the true extent of the expertise that had prevented what would have been one of the deadliest aviation disasters in recent history. But the unofficial story, shared quietly among aviation professionals and military personnel around the world, had already become legendary. Flight instructors at military academies were using sanitized versions of the incident to demonstrate advanced decision-making under pressure. Commercial airline training programs had quietly incorporated new emergency procedures based on techniques that Carmen had shared during extensive debriefings with aviation safety experts. Fighter pilots in combat zones were learning updated radio protocols that improved coordination with AWACS controllers during complex operations. Carmen herself had returned to what appeared to be a completely ordinary life in a modest apartment in Arlington, Virginia. To her neighbors, she was simply Ms. Martinez, a quiet, middle-aged woman who worked for a government consulting firm and kept to herself. She drove a practical Honda Civic, shopped at the same suburban grocery store every week, and maintained the same unremarkable appearance that had made her invisible on Flight 891. But her messenger bag now contained items that told a different story. Along with the everyday belongings that maintained her civilian cover, she carried credentials and communication devices that connected her to operations occurring around the world. 3 weeks after the Flight 891 incident, she had received a personal visit from General Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking woman in the United States Air Force, with an offer that represented both opportunity and obligation. Admiral Martinez, General Hayes had said, during their meeting in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, "The Air Force needs officers with your capabilities more than ever. The threats we're facing require expertise that can't be taught from textbooks or learned in simulators. What you demonstrated on that commercial flight represents the kind of thinking and skill we desperately need in our senior leadership." Carmen's response had surprised the general, not because she declined to return to active duty, but because of the alternative she proposed. "General, I've learned that the most effective service sometimes happens when people don't know you're serving. I'd like to propose a different kind of assignment." The program that emerged from their conversation existed in the shadows between civilian and military aviation, designed to identify and address emergencies that required capabilities beyond normal commercial or military procedures. Carmen became the focal point of a network that connected retired military aviation experts with active operations around the world, providing consultation and direct intervention when circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. Her first official case under the new program occurred just 2 months later, when a passenger aircraft carrying European Union diplomats experienced dual-engine failure over the Mediterranean Sea. Italian air traffic controllers received a request for glass corridor clearance from someone identifying herself with Carmen's call sign, and for 47 minutes her voice guided Italian military pilots and civilian aircrew through a coordination effort that resulted in a successful emergency landing in Sicily. The European passengers never learned the identity of the voice that had saved their lives, but their governments received classified briefings about the American military consultant who had prevented an international incident. Similar interventions followed: a cargo aircraft carrying humanitarian supplies that lost navigation systems over Afghanistan, a diplomatic transport that experienced flight control failures over the Pacific, a commercial flight with terrorist threats that required coordination with multiple international security agencies. Each incident was handled with the same operational security protocols that had characterized Carmen's intervention on Flight 891. Her identity remained classified, her techniques were documented for future training, but not for public release, and she continued to maintain the civilian cover that allowed her to operate without attracting attention from hostile intelligence services or media organizations. But the passengers from Flight 891 had not forgotten the woman who saved their lives, and their efforts to honor her service created an unexpected legacy that extended far beyond military aviation circles. Marcus Rothwell, the businessman who had mocked Carmen's presence in first class, had used his corporate connections to establish a scholarship program for military families whose members had been killed or wounded in aviation operations. The scholarship was funded anonymously and administered through veterans organizations, but everyone involved knew it existed because of their experience with Admiral Martinez. Dr. Vivian Cross had returned to her medical practice with a transformed understanding of how expertise and heroism could exist in completely unexpected forms. She had begun speaking at medical conferences about the importance of recognizing competence regardless of its packaging, using her experience on Flight 891 to illustrate how assumptions and prejudices could blind people to capabilities that might save lives. Flight attendant Jessica Hartwell had become an advocate within the airline industry for training programs that would help crew members recognize when passengers might have relevant emergency expertise. Her proposals had led to new protocols that allowed for passenger assistance during crises, potentially saving lives in future incidents where hidden expertise might be available. Little Amanda Torres, the 8-year-old girl whose terror had finally motivated Carmen to reveal her identity, had sent a letter to Admiral Martinez, United States Air Force, that eventually reached Carmen through military channels. The child's drawing of an airplane with Ghost 6, written in crayon, had become one of Carmen's most treasured possessions, a reminder of why she continued to serve despite the personal cost of maintaining her double life. Captain James Whitfield and First Officer David Reynolds had both requested additional training in advanced emergency procedures, recognizing that their encounter with Carmen had revealed gaps in their knowledge that could be addressed through military consultation programs. Their airline had quietly implemented new training protocols based on lessons learned from Flight 891, though the specific details remained classified. The most significant legacy of Carmen's intervention was something that no passenger could have anticipated: a fundamental shift in how military and civilian aviation emergency response was coordinated. The glass corridor protocols that had been activated for Flight 891 had demonstrated the value of integrating military expertise with civilian operations during complex emergencies. 6 months later, similar protocols were being quietly implemented at major airports around the world, creating networks of expertise that could be activated when conventional procedures proved inadequate. Former military pilots and aviation specialists were being recruited into consulting roles that allowed them to provide assistance during emergencies while maintaining the operational security necessary for national defense. Carmen's apartment in Arlington looked exactly like the home of an unremarkable government consultant, but the secure communication systems hidden behind false walls connected her to operations that spanned the globe. Her phone could ring at any hour with requests for assistance from situations that required her unique combination of technical expertise, command experience, and absolute discretion. But perhaps the most profound change in Carmen's life was the sense of purpose that had returned with her new role. The guilt and grief that had driven her from military service had not disappeared, but they had been transformed into motivation for preventing others from experiencing similar losses. Every life saved through her interventions honored the memory of Technical Sergeant Lisa Wong and justified the personal sacrifices that maintaining her cover identity required. On quiet evenings in her suburban apartment, Carmen would sometimes review reports from the incidents where her intervention had made the difference between tragedy and survival. The files contained letters from grateful families, commendations from foreign governments, and technical analyses of procedures that were becoming part of advanced aviation training programs around the world. She remained invisible to the general public, unknown to the media, and absent from any public recognition of her continued service. But in classified networks around the world, Ghost 6 had returned to active duty in a way that honored both her capabilities and her need for anonymity. The woman who had once commanded air operations across entire combat theaters now served as a guardian angel for anyone who needed extraordinary expertise in their darkest moments. The message was clear to anyone who understood the true story of Flight 891. Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Expertise doesn't always announce itself, and sometimes the most ordinary appearance conceals capabilities that can change the world. Carmen Martinez had chosen to remain invisible not from modesty or fear, but because true service sometimes required sacrificing recognition for effectiveness. In a world where everyone sought fame and acknowledgement, she had chosen the harder path of anonymous service, proving that the greatest heroes are often those whose names we never learn but whose actions echo through countless lives they touch. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.